This would have been much more interesting. I'm going to give a share on something I'm very excited about. This would have been much more interesting if we could do this. Rabbi Altman and I had one, for me at least, one of the most memorable car rides we shared back from Baltimore to New York, in which we could barely breathe. We were both speaking so fast. So that would be a little more fun. But the truth is, I'm giving something, and I invite feedback and participation. Should anybody have? Hecklers are welcome. I want to talk about something. It's really a share within a share. And it's part one today, so you'll have to retain all the information that we're talking about now and try to integrate it. Here's the basic idea. Here's the basic premise. We have some wonderful presentations that we make. We need them for ourselves. We need from Kiruv. We understand. One of my students once asked, I was describing some of my adventures in the world of outreach of Kiruv, working with forum and conservative groups, and he asked, Rabbi, are you, when you're talking to us and teaching us, are you doing Kiruv as well? And I said, of course I am, to myself. We all need Kiruv. We all need Kiruv. So in that, of course, that wonderful world of Kiruv, there's some very polished, impressive presentations. I'm going to plagiarize one of them. It's kind of an integration of multiple different approaches to Kiruv. I'm going to talk about it. And I want everybody to be thinking critically as we go through it, try to figure out, is this Kiruv presentation on the up and up? Is it something that passes intellectual rigor, and particularly, is it really honest and consistent with Torah values? The presentation is wonderful. If you've ever heard it, if you've never heard it, it's worth considering for the first time, for the third time. The presentation, it's called the way Eshet Torah does it. For example, Eshet Torah does among the most polished, thorough presentations in Kiruv. If you've never experienced discovery, you're missing out. You've never heard their presentation in the Bible codes and the 7 wonders of Jewish history. And here's one that they called World Perfect. It's probably most familiar. There's a rabbi named Ken Spiro, who is a great rabbi naturally because he's also a tour guide. And Rabbi Spiro is presents this from a historical perspective. World Perfect says like this. Here's the premise. The moral ideals of the world as they're assumed today, they're major ideas in the world. We consider them axiomatic in the way we live our lives. The right to life, that the world strives for a peaceful existence, which of course the corollary is we try as best we can to try to repudiate war in every way, shape, and form. That all people deserve to be treated equally and with dignity before the law, that there should be a law, there should be a system of justice, that everybody's entitled to an education, that human literacy is a great value, that families are paramount to a successful and healthy and moral society, that there should be stable family life, and that there should be social stability. And of course, to work towards the end of social stability, there should be welfare. We should have institutions that take care of animal rights and environmental rights. These are very much buzzwords in the Western world. And what the presentation argues, persuasively in many ways, I think, the presentation argues, of course, is that these are new phenomena. If we study the history of most world civilizations, we find in many instances the opposite, that these were not values. In fact, these were principles that were treaded upon. People rejected these ideas. Societies held these ideas as some of them as morally repugnant. And the genius of the Jewish people and the Torah that brought the world most of these ideas. That's the gist of the presentation, and we'll go through it. I think it's a powerhouse. I think we should consider it positively on its own terms. There's a lot of truth to it, but as I guess the title of this talk, this 2-part talk, indicates, I think there's a limitation, and we should, as much as we should be impressed, and we should realize the Torah, of course, is we can attribute all good things in the world to the Torah, but whether that can be tracked to the development of Western civilization, whether there's sometimes in our zeal to sell a point, to put over to the audience and to the people that are facing us that the Torah is true, that sometimes we have a tendency to exaggerate, and sometimes it's not even exaggeration, sometimes to misrepresent the ideas of the Torah, and how intellectual dishonesty could actually trap us and lead us astray. is a problem. So we should consider both of these. Certainly Torah values. And by the way, I don't see anybody out there. This is not a technology I'm familiar with. I don't know if I'm supposed to be seeing you. Is there a way, Rabbi Lutz, is there a way that people can interact if they choose? Are you there? Can you respond to me? No, so I'll just speak. Okay, I do that too all day. Although this year in Derech is quite wonderful. There's a lot of great feedback and great dynamism in the classes. Look, consider there's so much of Torah that sells itself. One of the problems that we see in Kiruv, I think it's a problem in Kiruv, is sometimes people oversell. Why do you need to oversell? The Torah is perfect on its own terms. So we talk about loving other people, not being vengeful, honoring parents, rebuking our friends. That's a subject, that's the source of true friendship. Worrying about our neighbor's property and well-being more than we're supposed to worry about our own property and our own well-being. That people are created in Hashem's image. Most people hear these ideas, and on an intuitive level, they know that they're correct, they're true, and they're not to sell so hard. Now, this presentation that emphasizes these values, again, let's review them. There's 6 of them, and we're going to be reviewing them. The values are, number 1, the right to life. Number 2, that the world should be a peaceful place, so a place that we work as much as we can to avoid war. Number 3, all people deserve to be treated equally. There should be justice. Number 4, there should be education for everybody. Number 5, the importance of a stable family in society. Number 6, that everybody is deserving of social stability, and we should work towards institutions of social stability. It's a very nice sounding world. Taking a step back and looking at this setup, it's a close but not precise way the Jewish tradition defines our ultimate endgame in history. If you're paying attention, glaringly absent from this presentation as it's given is much of a discussion of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and his role. In fact, often when you hear, and it's not just Eish Torah, I don't mean to pick on Eish Torah, they do wonderful work, but often in Kiruv, there's a tendency to play up, let's say, the role of the Jewish people. Certainly we are instrumental in history, but maybe not to mention HaKadosh Baruch Hu and his Torah as centrally, and maybe that's a challenge, because if you're targeting a secular target base and you talk too much about God, maybe you sound a little too much like an evangelical radio show, and you'll lose your target audience. And so in the beginning of many of these presentations, as I was listening and analyzing, it rubbed me wrong. It's not necessarily that the Jewish people brought the world the idea that everybody has a right to life. It's axiomatic in the Torah. The Torah, of course, comes from Hashem. So instead of focusing on Hashem, there's a tendency to focus on Hashem's ideas, which is pretty good. At least those that are more palatable to the modern audience. And these form a kind of utopian vision. And most people today, certainly with Western values, affirm that vision. And then they point out dramatically again that most of this is revolutionary. This is not the way of the world. It's not the way of the Yetzer Hara, and we don't see this reflected in most ancient cultures. They rejected these values. Before we get into this discussion, one last question. We've said so far is there are these values. They exist in the world today. In fact, they're quite dominant in most Western societies and increasingly in second, third, and fourth world countries. How did this happen? Where did this come from? What was this revolution about? And this is also something to consider, right? Why did these ideas suddenly become popular? Maybe because secular pluralism embraces all ideologies. Even though there's a downside to this in terms of assimilation, but what the positive side, of course, is if you can embrace all ideologies and you picture the university campus syllabus, so then Torah's Bible studies is going to have to figure somewhere in the scheme of things. And what that does, the effect of that, of course, is it gives Torah a leg in the door, something that in most ancient societies it never had. Nobody would listen to Torah ideas. Today, in secular societies, pluralism, suddenly we're getting some kind of a hearing. Now, they'll call it all kinds of distorted things. They'll call it, for example, the prevalent term is the Judeo-Christian influence. The reason why that's a distortion, we understand, is that whatever the goods they have in the Christian influence really can be traced back to the Torah. Foundation, of course, is the Jewish Torah influence. And Let's consider this approach. Let's consider this approach on its own terms. It's powerful and compelling. Again, there are two levels of this class, of this discussion. One is to consider the impact, residual impact in the Torah, how the world would not be as we find it today in its positive dimensions without the Torah, and then consider the limitations of such a presentation. Number one, the world today affirms a notion that human beings have a right to life. And this is a radical innovation and arguably new with the breakout of the Renaissance, of the Enlightenment, really the modernization of the last 200, maybe 300 years. In the pre-modern world, the notion of life was negotiable. Infanticide, for example, was an assumed feature in virtually every level of society. The primary purposes of killing children was often for selection of gender. Men were the ones who were valued. But certainly for other reasons, birth defects were often deemed good reasons to destroy a baby's life. And general population control, whatever the ruling class determined was necessary, was often the rule of the day. To quote an anthropologist, she writes, "Infanticide has been practiced on every continent and by people on every level of cultural complexity, from hunter-gatherers to high civilizations. Rather than being an exception, it has been the rule." And let's consider some of this as it manifests in history. Aristotle, who has till today been one of the great influences or one of the terrible influences in world history, he saw infanticide in moral dimensions. I'll quote from his book, Politics. Aristotle says, "As to the exposure of children," that was the go-to euphemism for child killing. You left them out to die, with unspeakable cruelty. But that was the way it was. So here's what Aristotle's take on it. He says, "To the exposure of children, let there be a law that no deformed child shall live." And that was the rule of the land. I remember going to Ashkelon, one of the relics they found in a Greco-Roman city from the Greco-Roman version of Ashkelon on the southern coast of Eretz Yisrael. About 2,000 years ago, they found some 50 to 100 skeletons in a well of newborns, indicating the prevalence just in one corner of the world. But this was not limited to one location. I'm giving just a sample. In Oceania, in one island in the Pacific, infanticide was carried out through all the ages, and it persisted well into the 20th century. Their mode of killing the child was through suffocating the baby. The first philosopher in world history that we see speaking out against the practice of killing children, guess who? A Jew. From the early first century, a fellow by the name of Philo, who spoke out against it, but he was a voice in the wind, in the void. Not just child sacrifice, human sacrifice was also widespread. Often people's own children, people didn't think twice about it. We see this indicated repeatedly through the Torah in the practices of the different idolatrous religions of the world. But one finds this, for example, at political funerals in the past. At virtually every significant funeral of a king, others had to die. So the king could be buried with, for example, 40 virgins. We find this, for example, on the day of Herod's death. Herod had ordered the arrest of all heads of households, all Talmidei Chachamim, and commanded that they should be slaughtered on the day of his funeral, so that his death day would be a day of great sadness for Klal Yisrael. Baruch Hashem, for us, his sister Shlomis was not courageous enough to carry out his will, so Herod died, and that was the end of it. Aztecs went to war to capture prisoners for sacrifice. Their preferred practice was to rip out the prisoners' hearts while they were still alive. And more famously, the Roman Colosseum, which had the masses for the spectacle. This in the Colosseum and elsewhere in the Roman Empire, we find the first acts of animal sacrifices, that slaughtered one another. And then the victorious animals were fed prisoners, or they were fed slaves. Many of them were Jews. They flayed their skins. They held gladiator fights to the death. Sometimes as many as 10,000 people were murdered in one day for spectacle. Men, women, and children. Sometimes in the span of just a few minutes. There's no correlation between the advanced culture, Rome was about as advanced as it got in the ancient world, and morality, what we consider morality. Human life was devalued. Some can argue, and this is where Rabbi Altman, just making sure, you said that maybe there could be interaction here? At the very end. Fine, look, I enjoy the interplay, but I can dominate the conversation too. So look, some of you might be thinking, hey, you know, we got plenty of this devalued human life. Look at the world. Look at the violence in movies. Look at the boxing and the fights at hockey matches. This is kids stuff, mild in comparison to the dominant lack of the value of human life through history. Moving to value number 2, the greatest waste of human life through history is, of course, war. Again, today we take it as a given that war is evil and meaningless and useless. Modern warfare, considered just the Great War, what later was called World War I, that I see Jacob Greenspan's name down there. Love to hear from him. So we know that war is the ultimate disrespect of human life, and it accomplished virtually nothing. And most of history is made up of the cruelest and the most relentless, the most relentless of wars. If infanticide was morally acceptable, then certainly death in war was of no concern to the people who waged the war and would send countless soldiers to their deaths, usually senselessly. Let the fittest survive. The term hero means protector. So the great heroes, Heracles in the Greek myth, Hercules for the Romans, he's described as a courageous figure. That's in the Odyssey. He's all of the world stands still for him. The cries of the dead, I'm quoting, rang out like the cries of birds, scattering left and right in horror as he came like night. And these are described in terms of adulation, of glory. He's a warrior, and that's the basic morality. As long as he's strong, nothing else matters. He's subject to great poetry. And you could also point to the modern media as saying, hey, none of this has changed so dramatically, but come on. We glorify violence and their heroes as nasty as they come, but it's muted and vicarious. Today, the specter of war is duly horrific. That's an innovation in the world. And again, the argument goes, and we're going to see this, the Jews brought this to the world. It's not natural that people should find this repugnant, should find the wars are evil. That's something that has to be learned and taught and practiced, and that's something that's gradually seeping into the human collective consciousness. Number 3, the average person in history, contrary to a lot of people's perception, had no right to any justice. There was no such thing as fair trial. This was not a given. Now, it's true today. Again, comparing today's standards with ancient standards, there are aberrations of justice. Very hard to find any just system in the world. But at least consider this. Fairness is a value today. At least if you're oppressed, if you get an unfair trial, so there's usually some kind of recourse. There's a court of appeals. In the times before the modern era, lower class people had no rights. Nobody considered them. Certainly not the peasants or the slave class themselves. And these were 99% of the human population, and we're generalizing, but this is throughout all times and through all regions geographically. The peasants, that means most of humanity, were totally disempowered. Serfs paid most of their income to their lords, or they were sharecroppers who gave their lords everything. The king was deified. He had all power. He was above the law. He had a tiny elite that ruled based on their birth, their wealth, or they ruled by the sword. If a nobleman, as many noblemen would do, would exercise their ultimate powers, would wound a serf, would rape a wife, would steal, that's just the way it was. That was the way it was through most of history. This important point, not well appreciated, it might explain another question, and that is, people are sometimes at a loss to explain the seeming general passivity of the Jews during the period that we call the Holocaust or the Shoah. Hard for us in the modern world where we take action, where we have recourse. There is a justice system. There's they can try them in The Hague for war crimes. But during the Shoah and up until the worldview of the Jews was that who are you supposed to turn to? Who are the powers that be that you could somehow expect a fair trial? There was nobody. And so the general going like sheep to the slaughter passivity of the Jews, not just in the Holocaust, that's in fresh memory, but through all of the ordeals of history, through the Crusaders and the expulsions and the Inquisitions and the Chmielnicki massacres, what were we supposed to do? The world was inherently an unjust place. Churchill has a line worth quoting. He points out that the democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the other forms, comparing the relative rules of the different times in history. We would add probably as a postscript that we would say that the Torah rule one day will be one of total justice, in which the individual, the lowly individual, will be looked after. And we'll defend this claim, and not today. We'll get to it in part 2. Number 4, if you're keeping track, again, we've reviewed the right to life, the importance of peace, the importance of a fair trial. These are not historically sound assumptions in most of human history until the modern era. Number 4, education, the right to literacy. Today, arguably, the claim is made, I think this is defensible, no first world country has high illiteracy, meaning most people have some basic level of education. The third world admittedly lacks much in the way of education, and even that's changing gradually as technology becomes cheaper and more accessible. But in pre-modern times, the estimate is usually made that less than 1% of the world's population was literate. Today, the estimate is something around 30%. I would take these numbers and not take them at face value. We can quibble over the differences, but there's overwhelming literacy today compared to a world that's not far in the distant past that was overwhelmingly illiterate. Education was clearly a luxury. Most people in the world, remember these serfs, the 99%, all they were doing in their life was trying to survive. Remember life expectancy in the pre-modern world, 30, 40. I just got my 10-minute warning. It's about right. It's about what I planned, but halfway through the material. All you could do was survive. Who had time to go and read a book? And they couldn't read anyway. You had to be rich to afford an education. And that was good. The governing powers that be, educated people were a pain. They're hard to control once they know something. They get uppity. They have new ideas. Think about this too. Think about the modern day, many of the revolutions. I mean, in America, you picture the protests in the 1960s, but you could picture Tiananmen Square. And most of the activists were students, people very much involved in learning about the world and seeing other possibilities in rising up against the cruel, corrupt ruling class. Well, that's education. That's what education brings. And so there was a vested interest in most governments to suppress education. It was dangerous. The Romans might be said to be an exception to this. The Romans did indeed have a school system. And it's claimed about 10% literacy, but that was purely self-serving. They needed it because the Romans had the world's first mass bureaucracy. And to run a bureaucracy, you need semi-literate or totally literate people at the helm. It was not open to most of the citizens. Illiteracy is actually a good recipe for stability if you can maintain it. But with education, we know that the church is terrified of education because the profound intrinsic irrationality of Christian theology repudiates education. They like to keep the people unlettered. That's where the Protestant Reformation changed everything. And the modern world, the notion of education has revolutionized everything. And in its potential, at least, could be serviced to teach people goodness in the spirit of the Torah. Number 5. We assume family morality. That's a modern assumption, and it's a Torah assumption, but it's an aberration of history. Most of the history we find that the family is unstable, and when the family is unstable, society is deeply, deeply unstable. The Olympic Games in Greece were typical. A celebration of the human immorality. The promiscuity, the licentiousness of the world was rampant in virtually every society. This is a tricky part of the topic to talk about, because we correctly, in Torah's view of morality, speak in Lashon Sagi Nahor, we speak in euphemism. And if you learn the very, very beginning of the first parak of Psachim, it talks about how the Torah bends over backwards to speak in Lashon Noki, in a clean, refined manner. We'll try to do the same in making reference to some of the immorality of the world. But Malahashi, we have to appreciate it and recognize the innovation of our standards of morality that's brought through the family by seeing the contrast. In most creation myths and most of the myths around the gods and goddesses, they're full of explicit stories. I'll let you fill in the details. Prostitution, bestiality were normal. Pederasty, that's the love between and mature men and young boys, was the highest form of love in many societies. In Greece, most famously, but even in samurai Japan, if a man's neighbor didn't take his 12-year-old son into a relationship, somehow the neighbor was insulted. That was the norm. Women were despised. The cultures were overwhelmingly misogynist. In another class, for another time, some of you have heard me talk about this, I argue that the Torah is the first progressive system in the world that elevates the woman, that gives the woman, gives women proper primacy in society and kedusha, separate but equal. And in most societies, women were despised and used primarily for procreation. As Palatus, one of the Roman writers, says, marriage brings only 2 happy days: the day he marries her and the day he lays her in the grave. And if he managed to get a few children in the bargain, so then he was fortunate. When the family is unstable, that obviously leads to a disastrous birth rate, and you have an upper class then that can't sustain itself. It's one of the major reasons, this doesn't take much thinking to consider this, that Rome and most other civilizations declined. Now, this all really folds. One step leads to the other. Number 6, and the final of the virtues of at least the modern secular Western world, with human sacrifice and with warfare, with really all of the above instability and the lack of education and the lack of family morality, certainly very few in the ancient world could care less about social welfare, looking out for the downtrodden. Most of these institutions that benefit the dispossessed of our world have existed for no more than 200 years. Poor people and sick people died by the roadside, and the wealthy and the middle class, if there was a middle class, would pass them and try to look the other way. Sick people just died. One of the reasons why the church plummeted in the public view during the Black Death in the 1300s was the clergy wouldn't administer last rites. They abandoned their parishioners and left them to the fates. And there was an outcry, understandably. That was the way of the world. Who cared about the small guy? We take institutions, public institutions like hospitals, like hospice, caring for the dying, even more contemporary, UNICEF, Doctors Without Borders. These are all radical modern features of a new world, and a world that's deeply influenced by Torah and Torah values. But this is, again, and to conclude this section of the talk, these are the exceptions to the rule of history. A more typical attitude towards social welfare in history was one of Genghis Khan. You remember Genghis Khan and the Mongols coming from the east to destroy the west. He had the largest empire of his day. And Genghis Khan is quoted as saying, the greatest happiness is to conquer enemies, to see them die, and to despoil their women. That was the ethic of the pre-modern world. With this background, Kiruv professionals then demonstrate the moral foundation of the world comes from the Jews. And here I wince a little bit. We didn't initiate these ideas. These are all from Hashem and our Torah. And they often try to prove their point. Of course, it's self-serving if you quote us, if you quote the Torah. But if you quote non-Jews praising the Jews, that's very impactful. So they do. We'll consider this also in our next talk. Of the intellectual honesty of turning to such scholars like Paul Johnson, who I'm about to quote, to glean the insights of Jewish history. But here's what Johnson says in his epilogue on the history of the Jews. 5-minute warning. So in his History of the Jews, Johnson, who is quotable, he certainly has a way with words. Listen to these. One way of summing up 4,000 years of Jewish history is to ask ourselves, what would have happened to the human race if Avraham had not been a man of great sagacity, or if he had kept his higher notions to himself, and no Jewish people had come into being? This is still Johnson. He says, to them we owe, to the Jews, we owe the idea of equality before the law, both divine and human. We owe the sanctity of life and the dignity of the human person, of the individual conscience, and so of personal redemption, of the collective conscience, and so of social responsibility, of peace as an abstract ideal, and love as the foundation of justice, and many other items which constitute the basic moral furniture of the human mind, writes Johnson. And who among us don't want to just kind of slap our knee and say, okay, right? And we can't take credit for this. This is all Kadosh Baruch Hu in the Torah, and of course, this is inevitable. And that the world is finally getting in on the goods, finally discovering the rich moral purity of the Torah. Istakli v'yoraisu v'ara alma, we all know. Hashem looked in the Torah and created the world, as the Zohar explains to us. And now humanity is finally getting a glimpse of this. Now, we have to point out the fact, even though we're giving Jews a lot of credit, that certainly there have been a lot of immoral Jews. In my history class, some of you who survived all of Jewish history with me, we remember that some of the villains of history have come from the Jewish people. But that doesn't detract from the fact that the Torah provides the world's moral foundation. And listen to John Adams, the second president of the United States, when he says, the Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation. If I were an atheist and believed blind eternal fate, I should still believe that fate had ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing the nations. Powerful argument. We go home stunned and amazed, and maybe this is familiar turf, but hearing it sometimes, a constant presentation, it kind of reaffirms our commitments and our understanding that Torah is min hashamayim. And next time, we'll try to take a look of this with a little bit of objective distance. I invite you and encourage you, if anybody wants to be in touch with me, if it has good feedback, I'd be thrilled. We'll try to consider this and try to understand. Hi, Elior. We'll try to consider what this means in as a key right. Sure, we'll do that now. As presenters of Kiru, is there anything here that also may be a little bit intellectually distorted and dishonest in presenting Judaism? And I have my own criticism, and I encourage you to come up with your own as we go, as we figure out a reasonable way of trying to present our case to the world, and certainly to disaffected Jews. Any questions for the time being?
If you want to ask questions, you have to unmute yourself, and then you can ask questions if there are any questions. You have to unmute yourself. I'll unmute you 1 second. I'll unmute you, Yaakov. Hold on. Hold on. 1 second. You should have an unmute button. 1 second. I don't see it either. Okay, you can ask a question in chat if it's easier for you. I see a few questions in chat there. Yeah, we see the chat. So you want to type in your question, Yaakov, in the chat. That's the best thing. No questions. Okay. Wonderful.
Okay. Great seeing your faces. And Bezras Hashem, we'll pick up here next time.
Okay, everybody. So a big thanks to Rabbi Herschel Lutz and to Rabbi Brucken for enabling us to do this. And also, of course, a big thanks to Rabbi Bleiweiss for making the time and energy. And we are looking forward to seeing you again. All the best.